digamos, uma história da metafísica, do fim da metafísica, e para aqueles que são da filosofia sabem que essa história é uma história heideggeriana. O que ele vai fazer hoje, ou agora, ele vai retomar a sua teoria da observação e do observador, e isso significa que vamos passar para uma leitura mais sistêmica, mais luhmanniana. Eu acho que ele vai retomar alguns conceitos. Por exemplo, quando ele falou quem é Hegel, ele, na verdade, não respondeu. Eu acho que a resposta seria, sabe, Hegel é um observador. Então, dessa maneira, sabe, acho que ele vai retomar a história, vai ser mais, sabe, mais a partir de Luhmann, nas observações, e acho que ele vai contar essa história do fim da metafísica a partir de uma mudança do estatuto de observador, o que ele chama de observação lateral e de observação hierárquica, mas não posso antecipar, é só uma expectativa, que aliás é também um conceito central de Luhmann, a estrutura de expectativas. Então, I open the path for you. The path is open.
Very good. I like an open path. Yeah. After this brief foray in the history of metaphysics, and particularly into the attempt by Hegel at thinking the absolute, which, by the way, is not that we think the absolute, rather the absolute thinks itself through us. When you think about the absolute, then it is not that we are here and the absolute is over here. That would be a division, that would be a fragmentation, that would be a schism. So it is not we on the one side and the absolute on the other. Rather, we are always in the light of the absolute. We are always in the light. The light is not in us, we are in it. And so for Hegel, the path towards the absolute is at the same time the path on which the absolute comes towards us. When we approach it, it comes to us. And where the two meet, that is what Hegel calls truth. So we do not think the absolute thinks itself through us. We do not make the absolute, we do not construct the absolute, rather who and how we are depends on how we stand in the light of the absolute. With this, we are now returning to the theory of the observer. And I want to begin with what it means to observe, so keep it on the mental. Observing is not the passive watching. To observe is not to mirror what is being observed. The observation is not a copy, a duplicate, a mirror of what is being observed. That bids farewell to causal theories of perception, where the object causes its representation in the subject or in the observer. And it also bids farewell to correspondence theories of truth. To observe is not to copy the world. The observing does not mirror what is being observed. For example, when you see your child, then you see your child. When someone else sees your child, that someone else sees a child, and not your child. And so seeing has nothing to do with optics. Seeing has nothing to do with the eyes. Seeing depends on the relation between observer and observed, and there are very many different possibilities for this relation. What sees is not the eyes. What sees is the relation between observer and observed. So seeing is relational and has nothing to do with optics, with the retina, with the visual apparatus of brains. Rather, what we see depends on who and how we are. And who and how we are depends on how we are related to what we see, and depending on the relation we disclose what we see in various ways. So you see your child, I see a child, the pediatrician sees the child in different ways, still in medical terms, in health terms, and so on. Observing does not replicate what is being observed. Rather, observing is a doing. And that is the first important point. It is not a watching, but a doing. To observe means to intervene in the world. To observe means to make an incision in the world. And that means that the world is not the same before and after the observing occurs. The observing does not represent the world, does not mirror the world. Rather, the observing changes the world. It now gains a way in which it can matter. Observing is an active doing, and what this doing is the drawing of a distinction. To observe means to draw a distinction. Now we are tempted to say that it is the observer who draws a distinction. But that is somewhat misleading, because it is not that the observer draws the distinction, but can also not draw it at all, or draw something else, or do something else. Rather, observing is the drawing of a distinction. This drawing of a distinction can be attributed to a particular observer. It can even be attributed to a person, and so person is a way in which observing attributes itself to a particular observer, but this is an attribution. Through the drawing of a distinction, two sides emerge. The drawing of a distinction distinguishes between two sides. These two sides are opposites of each other, and so they belong together. One is not the other, but one cannot be without the other. And so the drawing of a distinction is an incision into the world that allows something in the world to make a difference. To observe is to allow the difference to make the difference. So, for example, when we take the distinction between true and false, that's one possibility. True and false are opposites, but they are opposites of each other, and so they belong together. This belonging refers to a unity of the difference. So to observe is to establish the unity of the difference. The distinction is one, but it yields two different sides. The distinction itself is one, a unity, but it yields a difference. And so to observe is to establish the unity of a difference where the two sides are opposites, but opposites of each other. So true requires its opposite, false, and vice versa. One cannot be without the other. This question mark here refers to the origin of the distinction. Where does the distinction come from? What is the social origin, the historical origin of the distinction? An observer sees in the light of the distinction, but the observer cannot see that light itself. An observer moves within the distinction, but the observer uses the distinction as a resource that allows the establishing of a difference that makes a difference. To observe means to allow something to matter. To matter is to make a difference. If nothing makes a difference, then nothing matters. So the nothingness moves into that space where no distinctions are or can be drawn, where no distinction can be drawn or is being drawn, then nothing matters and nothing makes a difference. The nothingness is the eradication of difference, and then the distinction becomes an extinction, and the difference no longer makes a difference. Once an observer distinguishes between true and false, but not before, it makes a difference whether something is true or false. So when an observer comes into the world gains a way in which it can matter, in which it can make a difference. When an observer exits the world, then the difference turns into an indifference, and the nothing moves into the space formerly occupied by the distinction, formerly occupied by the difference. An observer can move inside what is called the domain of the observer. The domain of the observer is that space within which the distinction matters and makes a difference. An observer can move within this domain, but not outside of it. The observer who observes, for example, according to the distinction true-false, cannot, as it were, move out of this domain and observe something completely different. And so the distinction is the space within which an observer occupies a particular niche. The domain is like a niche in the world. So when an observer comes into the world, we will call this a mode of worlding. World, Heidegger says, in the emergency war semester of 1919, world never is, but worlds. What does it mean? Just as the absolute. We cannot find world next to the cup or next to the bottle or in between the cup and the bottle. Both cup and bottle are in the world, but the world itself is not, does not exist in the same way as bottle and cup, and neither is world the sum of bottle and cup and all other objects. So, when an observer comes into the world gains a way in which it can matter, in which it can make a difference, and that is a mode of worlding. When the distinction becomes an extinction, the observer exits the world loses a way in which it can matter and make a difference, and therefore we will call that a mode of unworlding. Worlding and unworlding. When an observer distinguishes, for example, between true and false, then the distinction itself is neither true nor false. Likewise, if the distinction is between legal and illegal, then the distinction itself can be neither legal nor illegal. So the origin of a distinction cannot be defined by the space that the distinction opens as its domain. And so to observe the origin of the distinction, we need to move beyond that particular observer and onto a second order observer. And that is called the sociology of knowledge. That is called archaeology in Foucault, following Nietzsche. That is the uncovering, the unearthing of the origin of the distinction, which again, in the case of true and false, cannot be true or false itself. The distinction between true and false is neither true nor is it false. Likewise, the distinction between legal and illegal is neither legal nor illegal. And so the distinction legal-illegal has its origin in something that transcends that distinction.
Então, passamos, passamos da filosofia e da história da metafísica para a questão o que significa observar. Ele disse que a observação não é uma representação, mas é uma produção, uma intervenção na realidade, e a observação, na verdade, se faz mediante, utilizando uma distinção que sempre vai distinguir dois lados, por exemplo, a verdade e a falsidade, o legal e ilegal. É o que você tem quando você tem uma observação que vai estabelecer essa distinção, é que vai abrir um domínio, digamos, da realidade que vai aparecer como resultado da observação. E essa distinção abre este campo, digamos, produz este campo no qual um certo aspecto da realidade pode já aparecer, e sua distinção. Pode ser que a distinção não seja mais operante. Neste caso, o que temos não é diferença, mas indiferença. E acho que é mais ou menos isso. Ele retomou a questão também de onde vêm as distinções. E lá ele está passando, eu acho que ele está introduzindo a sociologia do conhecimento e também, por exemplo, a genealogia, que vai estabelecer, digamos, essa história dessas distinções.
Now we see that in between the two poles, the two opposites, this space right here, the crossing or the passage. The crossing is a zone of indeterminacy and uncertainty. We have for the opposite poles of the distinction, either or. Either something is legal or something is illegal. Either something is true or something is false. Either something is a subject or something is an object. In the crossing, things are not that neat. Things are undecided. The crossing is a zone of ambiguity, indeterminacy, and uncertainty. It is a zone of becoming, where the beings, the entities inhabiting that crossing are not sure of who they are, of where they come from, and where they are going. The crossing is a zone of a transformation, of a metamorphosis. So the either or on the two opposite sides of the distinction is replaced in the crossing by a neither nor. The crossing is a neither nor, and not an either or. The crossing is populated by hybrids, which are in between. What we find here is Creole cultures, for example, that exist at the intersections, at the zones in between, which do not really belong either here nor there. So there are a neither nor, and so the crossing is a zone of uncertainty where the being of the either or gives rise to a becoming. The zone of the crossing, the passage through which the observer moves, is such a zone. The crossing, as the neither nor, is at the same time a zone of despair. And not just despair, but doubt. The crossing is the side of doubt and despair. Doubt in German is Zweifel. It contains zwei, two. Likewise, in German, despair is verzweiflung. And so you have the same zwei in here. Doubt, however, is more cognitive and as such easy to resolve. I can be in doubt whether or not Paris is the capital of France, but that doubt can be remedied rather easily. With despair, Verzweiflung, it is much different, much more serious, if you will. Despair is not a cognitive, it is an existential condition. And so Hegel says, the crossing through the passage is the experience of despair, which is a not yet, and at the same time, a not anymore. The neither nor is at the same time a not yet and a not anymore. A being is not anymore in the crossing what it was, and it is not yet what it will be, and so it is suspended in existential despair. This shows you that Hegel is not really an idealist at all. Rather, we find in Hegel the origin and core of modern existentialism. The crossing is a matter of existence. The crossing is not simply a matter of knowing and not knowing or uncertainty. Rather, the crossing and going through the crossing is to be suspended in an existential state of despair, of being torn, ruptured, schism. Not yet, not anymore, neither nor.
Então, vimos que com a distinção, temos uma distinção clara entre dois lados. Agora ele está olhando para o meio, que ele chama de crossing, o cruzamento, encruzilhada, na qual você tem a indeterminação, porque não é de um lado, nem do outro lado, é o nem, que é uma zona de indeterminação, é uma zona também de transformação, é uma zona onde tem os híbridos, que são indefinidos, que são indistintos, e também a zona de o desespero. E lá ele voltou para o Hegel, porque na zona de o crossing do encruzamento, na passagem, exatamente o passado não está mais e o futuro não chegou ainda. Então, nessa zona de indeterminação, indistinção, a confusão é existencial.
An observer can see in the light of the distinction, but cannot see that light itself. We see something in the light, but we do not see the light itself. The light is the light that comes into the crossing. The crossing is therefore what Heidegger calls the clearing. The clearing, like the clearing in the forest. It is an opening where the light can fall into, so that something can be seen in the light. The light comes into the crossing, into the clearing, and from there illuminates both sides. So we have, for example, light and dark, but the clearing is neither light nor dark. The clearing is the twilight. The observer cannot see the origin of the distinction, cannot see where the distinction comes from, and so the observer is mostly a blindness. The observer is a double blindness. First, the observer is blind to anything that matters and makes a difference outside of the domain of the observer. So, for example, the distinction ugly, beautiful cannot continue within the domain carved up by true, false. So what we cannot have is a distinction, true, false, beautiful, or legal, illegal, politically incorrect. That is not possible. So the observer cannot step out of its domain, and that is its first blindness. An observer is blind to all other domains that are carved out by different distinctions. At the same time, the observer is also blind to itself. It is a blindness to its own origin. The observer can see in the light of the distinction, but it cannot see the distinction itself, the observer cannot see the unity of the difference.
Então, o que temos é o observador que ele vai observar e vai observar a partir dessa distinção que vai abrir o domínio dentro do qual, digamos, as coisas podem aparecer. O observador, entretanto, é cego, ele é duplamente cego. E agora vou lembrar dessa frase de ontem de Luhmann, que o observador pode ver o que ele pode ver, aliás, o que está constituído no domínio, mas ele não pode ver o que ele não pode ver. Aliás, ele não pode ver o que está fora do domínio e também ele não pode ver a distinção que constitui o domínio. Então, agora ele vai introduzir um truque para poder ver o que o observador não pode ver.
As a result, there are severe limits to self-observation. There are very severe limits to reflexivity. Take, for example, the observer physics. The observer physics cannot observe itself in and on its own terms. The reason for that is that physics is nothing physical. Physics does not consist of particles, it consists of communications. And so physics cannot explain itself, account for itself, observe itself in and on its own terms. Neither is biology anything biological. Biology does not consist of molecules, chromosomes, cells, and such. Biology cannot observe itself in biological terms, and so biology is not a reflexive observer either. Neither is Darwinism, to take a third example, the result of natural selection. Darwinism is not the result of evolution. And so Darwinism can also not account for itself in its own terms. It cannot observe itself in its own terms. Physics cannot observe itself, and therefore we need metaphysics. Metaphysics is a second-order observer of the first-order observer physics. With that, we are now ready, hopefully, to introduce an important distinction in the theory of the observer. The theory of the observer is a reflexive theory, and so it applies to itself. And if all observing is the drawing of a distinction, then the theory must itself distinguish, and it does distinguish first between lateral and hierarchical observers. The crucial difference between lateral and hierarchical distinctions is that in a lateral distinctions, the two sides are on the same ontological plane. They're on the same ontological level. And so the crossing, the movement through the crossing is a horizontal movement that does not move itself to, say, a different order or level of being. The two sides of the distinction are on an ontological par. In the hierarchical distinction, that is not the case. One side is seen as being above the other. Meta, the Greek term, means above and beyond, and so metaphysics is a hierarchical observer in which the meta occupies a special ontological position as that which is both above and beyond the physical.
Ele começou observando que a biologia não pode pensar a si mesmo em termos biológicos. A física não pode pensar a si mesmo em termos biológicos. O darwinismo não é o resultado da seleção na evolução, mas então precisamos de uma teoria reflexiva que é capaz de se pensar. Ele diz que a teoria da observação pode fazer isso. Ela pode se pensar em termos de a sua própria observação. Vocês vão se lembrar que na primeira parte era sobre o fim da metafísica, e agora ele vai introduzir, digamos, uma distinção importante entre a observação lateral, na qual a distinção estão no mesmo nível, estão laterais, e as observações que são hierárquicas, como, por exemplo, o sagrado e o profano. O sagrado é mais alto, é mais meta, é mais em cima de o profano. E acho que ele agora vamos deixar falar.
Since in a hierarchical distinction the two sides do not occupy the same ontological level, the crossing assumes a special significance, because it is no longer a lateral, a horizontal movement, it is now a vertical movement. And so the movement through the crossing is an upward movement, it is a rise. The two most important hierarchical observers are metaphysics and religion. As we have already seen, the most important distinction in a religion, the distinction around which a religion revolves, the distinction without which no religion can be, is the distinction between the sacred and the profane. Therefore, the movement through the crossing is a movement from the profane towards the sacred. That movement through the crossing towards the sacred is the path of salvation. The path of salvation requires a drastic transformation in the profane mode of being. One cannot approach the sacred as one approaches any profane entity or being. Rather, in order to approach the sacred, one must elevate. This is an elevation. One must elevate oneself into a different mode of existence. One must go through a metamorphosis, which metamorphosis is a purification. To approach the sacred, it is necessary to purify oneself from all profane concerns or interests. The sacred demands that it be approached for its own sake, and not for ulterior motives, instrumental or rational motives. Therefore, the path toward salvation is a self-purification in which we shed our normal, ordinary mode of being and transform ourselves in such a way that we are in the proper mood and in the proper mentality for moving closer to the sacred.
Ele está fazendo uma teoria da observação e introduz a distinção entre observações laterais e observações hierárquicas, e você tem dois observadores hierárquicos que vão utilizar a distinção, mas vai sempre ser baixo e alto. A primeira é a religião, e a religião vai intervir exatamente nessa passagem intermediária. Essa transição do profano para o sagrado pressupõe uma purificação, uma metamorfose, uma transformação do observador mesmo, que vai do baixo, digamos, pelo alto, do profano pelo sagrado.
In Hegel, the profane is the realm of common sense. That is what is otherwise known as the natural attitude. Common sense is the world in which we normally live, in which we routinely live. Common sense is what Husserl calls the life world. For Hegel, as well as for Marx, philosophy is an eminently practical affair. Philosophy is not a branch of knowledge, neither is it an occupational specialization, neither is it that which is taught in departments of philosophy. For Hegel, as well as for Marx, philosophy is a doing, and the doing of philosophy is the overcoming of our commonsensical mode of being in the world. It is an overcoming of the natural attitude. And so, in Hegel, the path from common sense to philosophy is called education. Education is an educere. One is led out of something, and the out of something, that is common sense. Education therefore means the movement out of common sense through the passage of despair towards philosophy. The doing of philosophy is the movement across the enlightened path towards the source of the light. Education is therefore not something that one could have. It is not something that one could receive. For Hegel, education is the transformative movement in which we drastically abandon our common mode of being and elevate ourselves into a philosophical mode of being. Philosophy and common sense are not modes of knowing simply. It is not that one knowledge is replaced by another. Rather, the movement out of common sense and towards philosophy is a radical transformation in our mode of being And so education is not learning in the sense of the filling of mental containers with information that these containers from time to time emit during exams and other testing ordeals. Rather, learning and education is a radical transformation in our mode of being in the world, in our mode of encountering the world. In the opposite direction, from the sacred to the profane, in Christianity this happens as Jesus Christ. And in other religions, it happens as prophetic revelation. Through the prophecy, the sacred announces its presence in the world, and so when there is an upward movement, there must also be a downward movement, and the downward movement is the coming into the world of the sacred through the prophetic, charismatic revelation.
Então sabemos que tem dois observadores hierárquicos, que é a religião e a filosofia. Ele explicou a religião, agora ele passou para a filosofia, que é a passagem também do baixo para o alto, do senso comum do mundo da doxa, do mundo do mundo da vida, o mundo do senso comum. A filosofia é uma observação, mas uma observação, digamos, que é também uma ascensão do profano para, digamos, o conhecimento mais alto. Para estabelecer essa passagem, a educação é importante. Então, a passagem do mundo profano e do mundo mais alto, digamos, passa pela educação, que é essa transformação interna. E não somente você tem a passagem, digamos, do profano para o sagrado, mas também na religião você tem um movimento inverso. Isso é quando o sagrado entra no mundo pela revelação, pela profecia, ou, por exemplo, pela incorporação com Jesus Cristo.
The coming of the sacred into the world and the movement out of the profane world to the sacred lead to a meeting point which occurs in the crossing. This meeting point can also be represented like this, where the coming toward us of the sacred intersects and meets and encounters with a movement out of the profane towards the sacred. Where these two meet, that is that point. And with that, I will stop for today, and maybe you have some questions now at this point. Yeah?
Então, com isso, estamos, na verdade, chegando ao início, segundo início do fim, que é a sessão dialógica interativa. Então, qualquer pergunta é bem-vinda. Quem vai abrir o jogo?
Vou falar em português, né? Eu quero saber um pouco qual é a potência para a teoria do observador da ideia de crossing. Eu sei que o senhor deixou um pouco aí no final, precisamente, a questão de crossing, mas me parece que pode ser, pelo que eu li do texto que foi disponibilizado. Eu acho que essa é uma ideia bastante potente e gostaria de, se o senhor consegue falar alguma coisa para nós. Obrigado.
He asked a question about the crossing and how it appears in your theory observation. He's got kind of the intuition that it's a very powerful notion, but if you could actually elaborate it a little bit more, I mean, from the point of view of the theory of the observer.
Sure.
senso comum para o outro. A tendência é que desapareça o senso comum, desaparece o profano. Né? Então, a crossing tem uma potência que leva a um outro patamar. E o que acontece no ponto de partida? Tá? Então, esse deve ser um pouco melhor que agora eu estou respondendo.
Pegar lugares o movimento oposto, né? É possível o movimento oposto.
Não tem falado do movimento.
Não. Mas pegando a ideia também, como poderia ficar o próximo movimento oposto.
Se há um movimento.
Sim. Clarissa has a question about the beginning and the end. What happens, in fact, with common sense? Because if common sense is going through the ascension, what happens at the end with common sense? And you also, our friend said, but if you have the opposite moment, the moment of emanation, I mean, indeed, what happens, in fact, with the beginning and the end? What happens with how does the one transform the other?
Yeah. We have here some possibilities for a hierarchical distinction, and the best way probably to explain the crossing is not from a lateral but in a hierarchical distinction. A hierarchical distinction is also the distinction between subject-object. So, for Hegel, the becoming of the subject is the transforming of the subject in its object mode towards the subject in its subject mode. So, here we have the subject as subject, and here we have the subject as object. This is the alienated subject, the reified subject, the subject that sees itself as object, the subject that sees itself as determined by the object. That is common sense. In common sense, when we see something, why do we see something? I see the wall over there or the pictures over there. Why do I see them? Because the pictures are really there. Yeah? That is the explanation for why I see them. I see the wall because the wall is really there. And so my seeing is determined by what is there, by the object. The object determines the subject. Yes? That is common sense, that is the natural attitude. The movement out of common sense, out of the natural attitude, that is the movement towards philosophy, or in the case of religion, towards the sacred. It is the movement from common sense and out of common sense towards a different mode towards a different plane of existence. For the most part, we are stuck in common sense, because common sense is our home. It is the home in which we normally and ordinarily live. To leave that home is fraught with dangers and risks. We become homeless. The homelessness occurs as we move out of common sense, out of the comfortable prison of our everyday certainties, which we usually do not call into question. Common sense is the taken for granted. It is the routine, the ordinary, the normal. And so to move out of common sense is fraught with dangers and risks and uncertainties. It is a movement towards or through the neither nor of despair. And so when we become homeless, we are no longer certain of who and how we are. We are on the move, but that move may at each point collapse back into common sense. Our out of common sense may at all times be such that we are drawn back into the gravity of common sense. Think of common sense as a field of gravity. A radical transformation, a path through doubt and despair, which at each point may be interrupted, may be stopped, may be arrested. And that is metaphysical death, what I mentioned earlier in Hegel. Yes? The subject as object is metaphysical death, because it is an arrest in our becoming. It is a freezing of our common mode of being into a permanent state. And so we can move out of common sense. But the force field, the gravitational force field of common sense is so strong that we can escape from it only at certain times, only under certain conditions, only for a certain period, until common sense draws us back into itself. This is what Heidegger calls the Verfallen, the fallenness. Yeah? It is the opposite of a rising, but the rising can at each point become falling back into our normal everyday routines. Yeah? Yeah? Okay.
Time for MC desta vez for Portugal.
Do you see any possibility to dialogue between Western philosophy, theory, and observation, and Chinese, for example, philosophy, Taoist, something like this? Because also this kind of philosophy is not dualist.
Yeah. The sacred can assume very many different forms. And so whatever the sacred is in the various world religions, the basic structure is the same, at least according to Durkheim. So the sacred can be the afterlife, it can be the Christian heaven, it can be the nirvana. But in each case, to get to that state requires a renunciation of one's ordinary profane mode of being. It requires a purification of self. It requires a dismissal, a refusal to live the profane life with its normal rewards and resources. And so whatever the sacred is, the path towards the sacred is always a path of transformation, and metamorphosis.
It's like mystic, no?
Like
Mystic.
Mysticism.
mysticism, yeah. Yeah, sure. Yes.
Difícil. Você pode traduzir?
Ou mais perto.
Temos uma representante aqui do Departamento das Letras que vai traduzir para nós. Obrigado. You don't have a professional translator.
She has a question. It's related to what our colleague was saying before.
Partindo da teoria de Luma, assim, as observações estão conectadas às outras, quer dizer, as passadas e as futuras. Como pode haver esse piar, essa linha divisória entre uma operação e outra? Assim, a gente chegar a observações que chegar a uma expectativa já gerada no sistema.
She's saying that she's asking if this theory, Luma theory, is related to other observer theory, and if this can be related to the expectations generated by the observer and by the system. Oh, and she's also asking, what time is this observant really observing? What's the time of the observer?
The time of the observer?
Yes.
Let's take the observer metaphysics. The time for the observer metaphysics is a particular historical world. Metaphysics is the truth of a historical world. It is the truth within which a historical world whirls. And so the time of the observer metaphysics is the time within which the historical world emerges and disappears, is born and dies, has its spring and its winter.
And now my question. You said that the observer is in the light, but we don't see the light as observers. But how can we establish a point of observation if we don't see the light, if we are in the light? That's my doubt. I don't know how to recognize this situation.
Very good. Normally, yes. When we see something, we see that something. And we usually attribute our seeing to that something. We see something in the light, but we do not see the light itself unless and until the light fades. And then all of a sudden we pay attention to it. So there is one phase in the life of the observer when the light does become visible, when the observer, as it were, turns from its embeddedness in the world around towards the light. So it is a turning around, and that occurs when the light is fading. Then we wonder, where is it?
I also have a question, and I think I'm taking them a little bit together. In your talk, it's basically phenomenology, at the same time a phenomenology of the spirit, and also a phenomenology that's coming from Heidegger. Or Italian friends said that's mystical.
Yeah.
How do you make the transition? And of course, it's also about the end of metaphysics. How do you make the transition? What is exactly the historical time? So is that a story of disenchantment you're telling us? Is it a story where in fact what you're doing is kind of a historical phenomenology of a time which is past and in which now, the world is absolutely shining in its emptiness, I mean shining in its positivism and its empiricism. Is that, how you make the transition from philosophy to sociology? So are you doing something like a historical phenomenology, and it's not, it's something of the present, of the past?
It's not just something of the past. We can have a phenomenology of the present too, and that is what Heidegger does with his notion that late modernity is the arrival of the Gestell. The Gestell is a particular way in which the world whirls. The Gestell is very similar to what Latour calls technoscience. So for Heidegger, late modernity is that time in which the distinction between subject and object becomes the Gestell, and the Gestell is the way in which the techno-scientific world whirls. For Nietzsche, on the other hand, the worlding of the modern world is the advent of nihilism, when the meta disappears and the world becomes one-dimensional. So we can have a historical phenomenology of the modern world, and for that phenomenology we need not to turn to Husserl. Husserl's phenomenology is very Cartesian, of course, for Husserl's Cartesian meditation. So for Husserl, phenomenology has to do with the intentional relations to the world that emanate from a consciousness. That is a very different kind of phenomenology from Heidegger. And so I think the best way to arrive at a phenomenology of the modern world is through Nietzsche and Heidegger.
Mais uma pergunta, mais diálogo. All right. So, you're doing a phenomenology of the earth spirit, and what are you going to do tomorrow? Can you give us a small preview of
Tomorrow, we will do the distinction between first and second order observing, which is similar to the difference between realism and constructivism. And after that, Raquel mentioned that some of you might be interested in some empirical applications of the theory of the observer. So I will try to, tomorrow, also give a framework that allows us to explain variations in observers that can be empirically observed, empirically tested in certain ways.
Can we expect a happy end?
I wouldn't go that far, but what we can expect is the end.
Tudo bem, obrigado a